Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We'll just let everyone trickle in, and hopefully if you miss, you guys have all been getting the videos. I redid video 1, by the way. Okay, I took just the sound and put it with the slides to match all the other ones and make it less distracting. Okay, so if you need to go back, I think I would recommend it in the sense of I'm taking about 3 years of material and putting it into 8 weeks. So you're getting a fast track cultural immersion. Now, what you're not getting is the amount of time on each of these subjects, right? And the amount of discussion and everything. But that doesn't mean you can't do that on your own. And that's actually what it's intended, right? Because 8 weeks it's really just 8 hours, right? So I just want to make sure you know that this is good material. This week, we're getting started on ancient culture. Okay, and we'll go ahead and get started today. Children naturally come to Jesus. I don't know if you ever thought about that. This is my favorite picture growing up. It was in my Bible. Children naturally come to Jesus. We don't need to add to what God has already done. We bless people by removing their man-made obstacles, the hindrances to faith. If you've ever thought about that, sometimes we think we have to add to people in order for them to come to Jesus. But the truth is, we have to remove things from people because the norm, the natural, is for people to be drawn to Jesus, not to be drawn away. The drawn away is what we're trying to prevent. Okay, so I hope that makes sense there. And that's exactly what Jesus says, Matthew 19, right? Do not hinder the children. Okay, don't hinder the children. And so this is a good way to think. And I wanted to bring this up because we're going to talk about ancient culture, medieval culture, and then we're going to get to modern culture. And I hope we can spend 2 weeks on modern culture because, it's kind of like it just explodes as far as like just some really interesting intuitions and thoughts relating to modern culture from modern professors. Okay, and so there's a lot of good stuff there, but the modern culture is based on medieval culture, which is based on ancient culture. Okay, so starting at the root makes a difference, and that's where we're starting. But also ancient culture, I think, has a lot to do with not hindering, because when you see ancient culture, you see a culture that's kind of a beginnings, you could say, beginnings of how to view things. And so let's just jump in right now. I'll start. I want to start with a little bit of a review. Remember, our imagination processes meaning. It assigns meaning. And I did want to bring up, have you ever thought about this? What is the meaning of woman? Okay? I just want to bring that up. You ever thought about that? If you have a biological meaning, then you will reason out certain conclusions. For example, changing your gender is something you would think if your meaning of woman is biological. Okay? And but even currently, right? Even as a Christian, and maybe wherever you're at on your maturity, okay, the meaning of woman should continue to mature. This isn't static. Okay, when you think about this, here's another one: janitor. Okay, this one floored me when I first came across it. A guy was the janitor was in a hospital. A janitor of a hospital was talking to the patients, and I can't remember the exact circumstances, but he brought up how we really heal people here. We basically, he was talking in the sense of he's a member of the team that's healing people. Okay, but what is our meaning a lot of times is the janitor is the person who cleans the building, right? But you could say a healthy janitor, or maybe a janitor from their perspective, they're a team member just like the doctor. And they're all part of a team, right? See how vastly different meanings, and those meanings, they change what we think about and how we think about things, okay? Same thing with heaven. Common term, right? I mean, most of our faith is based on this idea of helping people know how to spend their eternity with God in heaven. And yet the meaning of heaven maybe really, there's degrees, there's no arriving here, but there's different degrees of understanding of what exactly does that refer to. And so I just want to bring this up because then once we assign meaning, once we understand the meaning of something, then we understand how meaningful it is. Part of it is it beautiful? Is it good? To what degree is it desirable? this meaning that I've come up with. Okay, and so these two aspects are really right in the, you could call it a bullseye of every culture. The bullseye of every culture is, what do they hear and how much do they value what they just heard? Okay, now as a Christian, your message has to understand both of these are elements of a good, you could say a good apologetic, or even just a good presentation of the message. Okay, and so we talked about how the reason then acts on the meaning and decides if it's going to be accepted or rejected, acted on or ignored, if it's something to be remembered or something to be forgotten. Remembered is important because some people, if it's important but they're not ready, they still think about it all the time, right? And so they may say no, but it's a no like they're thinking about it. And other people, it's like no, and they move on because or for some people, the message that they hear might be a no and move away as quickly as you can. And so there's a lot of, this was me, by the way, my reason, I had atheists in our apartment complex and they would talk I had Christians in our apartment complex. I was a second grader and they would talk to me about Jesus all the time. And my assigned meaning was some Santa Claus in the sky, and I would laugh. I'd laugh all the time. And then I went off to church on the school bus. And my imagination of what it meant for someone to love me and was changed. And that same week, I remember someone talked to me on the stairs, about God or whatever. And I remember thinking, this isn't so funny anymore. I was thinking about it, right? My reason changed because something changed in my imagination, okay? So we've talked about that, and we talked about the areas of universal meaning, belonging, purpose, story, transcendence, and suffering. Again, transcendence is one that sometimes we forget, but worship is not something that you just fell into and you're unusual in that. Every person desires transcendence and an experience of outside themselves or connecting who they are with something larger. Okay, right? So, if you want to check in right there. So, okay. By the way, we're going to go back to raising hands for now, okay, as far as questions. So just raise your hand or make sure I hear what you need, okay? So these are areas of universal meaning, and that leads to meaningful characteristics of 2024 America. Okay, and I'm going to link all this together as we go in the next four times together. But, people think about this all the time. I don't know if you realize, but 2024 America, some people believe, some professors believe that the God of our age is freedom. Okay, this is what we live and die for, is the ability to do whatever we want. It's a meaningful characteristic of America. Here's another one, the individual dignity dualism. Okay? And this idea here is that in America, we value the idea that every person has a degree of dignity. And that dignity comes from the inside out. Okay? Now, we're not talking right now about the validity of any of this. This is just a value that if a person believes something about themselves, then dignity, and this is what fills the imagination of America, you could say. Okay, that person deserves the dignity of living out what they believe from the inside out. Dualism is this idea that, and we'll talk about this a lot more when we get to modern culture. Okay, but the idea here is that in America we want to live with two different playgrounds. Okay, one playground is the objective, and the objective playground is full of things like science and technology and math and formulas. Okay, determinism is what it's called also. We have a separate playground, which is the subjective. Okay, we call it church, music and art. Okay, and those two shall never meet. It's almost like a value in America that this dualism should exist. So in other words, and I'll explain this later on, but I just want to bring it up. This is something that's a meaningful characteristic. Another meaningful characteristic in 2024 America is tribalism, right? This idea that everyone's got their friend circle. And that friend circle is where all their values found. And I say the word social networking, it doesn't necessarily refer to Facebook or Instagram. It just refers to this idea that technology has made it easier for us to find one another. And once we find our little groups, that's something that we hold on to. And that's something that's meaningful to us. And this used to be what I guess you could say would be characterized by the church. And it still is, but it's bigger than that in 2024 America. And collective character. Okay, this is a new thing here, and we'll talk about this later on. I just want to bring it up because it's a meaningful characteristic. But the idea here is that there are certain qualities that all Americans are expected to have. Okay, there used to be a time when you could believe whatever. Okay, but that's not what you live in now. You live in a time now where there's some qualities that every person should have. And if they don't have them, you'd use a word, they're deserving of being canceled, right? You know, it's interesting. It's a similar term to excommunicated in the church, right? You know, this idea of if you don't meet a certain base set of collective character, then you're fair game to be canceled, removed from what's meaningful in America. Okay, so I just want to bring this up. We'll refer to a lot of these coming up, but I wanted to introduce them this week. Brief history of Western culture. Okay, we're going to look at Western culture and why. Well, I think it would take way too long to start everywhere. But Western culture is the pervasive culture that you're interacting with every day and that you're probably going to understand. Okay, so let's keep going. There's ancient culture, medieval culture, modern culture, late modern culture, and postmodern culture. Okay, so yes, sir.
You might want to just put the silencer on.
Oh, yes, thank you. Yes, I will do that. There we go. I think I got that. Okay. Now, I bring up these just to clarify here. Okay, ancient, medieval, modern. The modern culture was like the 1850 on. Okay. Late modernism is actually what most people for the last 50 years called postmodernism. Okay, it was really mislabeled, and so really it's been relabeled by a lot of people as late modernism. So that you'd say up until like 2010 was actually called late modernism, although it was a lot of textbooks will refer to it as postmodern, but it wasn't really. Okay, and then the modern era is called postmodernism, but then people who refer to the up till 2010 as postmodern, they'll refer to your current culture as meta-modern. Okay, so I hope, does that make sense? So you can either choose the late modern, postmodern, or you can choose postmodern, meta-modern, and they're both referring to the same thing. Okay, and these are all just different aspects of Western culture. We're going to talk about each of these in detail. Okay, but any questions so far? Are y'all following? Is that, you good? Okay, let's keep going. Okay, so why look at Western culture? Well, how did we get here? Okay, you know, what's interesting is today, but to talk about today, you have to know how you got there. Like it's almost like if you're looking at a maze, knowing how you got to there is the key to getting your way out of it. Okay, so how did we get here? That's why we're going to look at some of these. Here's another one that's important. What are the underlying hindrances? How can I clarify a go-forward path for the culture, right? To identify where did the hindrances come from, you have to be able to understand at what point were they introduced and what was the effect on the culture that you live today. Now, what relevant thinking has shaped history, right? Now, I'm not going to give you an entire history lesson. Obviously, that's impossible. What I'm going to do is briefly talk about some of the most culturally relevant aspects, okay? Now, am I leaving stuff out? Absolutely. We're doing 8 hours in 8 weeks, right? You know, that's pretty hard to pull through, and I spent a lot of time on picking and choosing, okay? But so if you bring up something, go ahead. Feel free to bring up other elements, okay? But I'm just going to pick up some of the most relevant ones, okay? And I do want to make sure, it's a quick snapshot, right? It's a summary of some key ideas. By no means trying to say this is comprehensive, but it should be very helpful as far as I'm trying to give you the ideas that we can connect from one week to the next. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so with that said, ancient culture. Okay, we're going to begin with Homer. So no one actually knows what Homer looked like, but that's an art piece of what they expected, right? He wrote the Odyssey and ancient literature, and basically the ancients, way back to Homer, you're talking about ancient Greece, they believed that there were 3 influences on the lives of men. Okay, 3 influences. Why does this matter? Because this is secular thinking. Okay, where did people's minds go? Okay, and what you see the ancient Greeks through Homer, they believed in a fundamentally chaotic world. In other words, for the most part, things just happened. And they were random almost, except for these influences. One was the influences of the gods. Okay? People always believed, as far back as you can go, in the influences of the gods. Hey, when you talk about the influence of the gods, you can know it has a home. It always has had a home. Okay? And when you bring up the living God, that has a home in Western culture. It always has. Way back, as far back as you can go. The influences of fate. Okay, there was a understanding that in the middle of the chaos, there were certain things true since birth. And the influences of fate were greater than the influence of the gods. Okay, the greatest influence on your life was the influence of fate on your life. There were certain things that were definitely going to happen in your life. And the fates are usually portrayed as three spinners spinning out your life. And then the gods were subject to that. Sorry. Okay. Even the gods are subject to it in the influences of men. Right. So this was ancient, as far back as you can go. Three influences in the middle of chaos. Okay. So chaos was interrupted by fate, the gods, and by men. We see the ancients admired heroes and anti-heroes. They didn't seem to care too much about morality. Okay? But bravery, strength, dedication, faithfulness, intelligence were always in style, you could say. Okay? As far back as you go in history, bravery, strength, dedication, faithfulness, intelligence. And you could ask yourself the question, how would you baptize these qualities and lead a culture to truth, beauty, and goodness? Okay? In other words, if you were talking to the ancient Greeks in a time when they believed in fate and the gods and men, there's a path forward of talking about your faith simply through bravery, strength, dedication, faithfulness, and intelligence. Okay? You don't have to rely simply, now I'm not saying simply like making light of it, but you don't simply have to rely on right and wrong. Okay? The ancient cultures didn't care about right and wrong too much, but yet they still had certain qualities. You could have an anti-hero, somebody who was way out there as far as today, Breaking Bad, right? You could have an anti-hero. And they were respected and they were thought highly of, and because they still had these qualities. Okay, so let's keep going. Plato. He had some principles that influenced a lot of Western thought. Okay, I didn't know if you knew this. Okay, by the way, Plato. God sent, you could say, a secular trio of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Okay, each was the student of the next. And it was a triad of three of the most influential men in history altogether. And yet these three were one after the other. They were back to back. Okay? Incredible respect and culture for Plato, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Now, they have gone out of style a little, mainly because these three also, all of their thinking for Western culture, all of their thinking included lots of thoughts about God. As a matter of fact, their thoughts included the idea of a singular God. They were called the pre-Christian philosophers because even though they weren't Christian, they talked so much in terms that you and I would recognize today. Okay, so much so that most Western thought today tends to veer away or steer away from Plato or Aristotle. Not because they don't respect them, but simply because what their thoughts aren't in agreement with people today. Okay, and so I bring that up to say that we can learn a lot from Plato and Aristotle as far as the foundations of Western culture, but also what God was seeding civilization with to prepare it for the coming of Jesus. Okay, so, because Plato and Aristotle were right pre-Jesus. The other thing we get is, we're used to thinking in terms of sharing the faith with a culture that's familiar with the Bible. Okay, well, Plato and Aristotle, they were writing pre-Bible in a lot of ways, right? They were writing from a totally different culture than Jewish biblical culture. And that's helpful to study because you think, well, this is how secular people think or how they can think. What's considered respectable thinking. Okay, so does that make sense? So Plato is really important to remember. The principle of the triad influenced Christianity for more than 1,000 years. Okay, this was really important. And basically what it said was, it's impossible that two things only should be joined together without a third. There must be some bond in between both to bring them together. God and man can encounter one another only indirectly. There must be some wire, some medium, some introducer, some bridge, a third thing of some sort in between them. See, he's actually talking about Jesus here, right? And in between God and man, there must be an intermediary. Okay, but he wasn't just talking about God and man. Demons, that's really basically angels, right? Demons fill the gap. This is not demon, D-E-M-O-N, okay? But demons fill the gap. We shall find Plato himself and the medievals endlessly acting on this principle, supplying bridges or third things between reason and appetite, soul and body, king and commons. Okay, so I'll give you an example, okay? This is just a way to think. I mean, he was a philosopher, right? So, you know, you gotta... So, like, here's an example. Have you realized that when you touch somebody, you're still you, and like, let's say I touch my boy right here, Evan, okay? You know, I touch him, right? I'm still me. It's easier than talking about somebody else, right? Yeah. I'm still me, and you're still you, right? And so when you touch, you're not actually touching. There's a third thing required. Yes, Eliana. Okay.
So, do we think that the reason why, since he was pre-Jesus, is it possible that the reason he brought up like some sort of like mediator between God and us being Jesus was because he had heard about like how there was going to be a second or the coming of Christ?
You know, yeah, it's interesting because we'll talk about how he talked about a philosopher king to rule over all of us. And it was the only way to rule. We'll talk about that in a minute. But he was thinking more just simply out of thought about how things work. Okay, and it goes back to physicality. Okay, and the idea is that I have a definite boundary, and you have a definite boundary, and there's nothing I can do to touch you. Okay, in other words, if I touch you, there's an intermediary, and what you call that is love. Okay, when you recognize you were touched, you know, which is not physically touch, you're just saying, you know, you were touched by something, then what you're saying is something happened between me and you that's more than me and more than you. Okay, and this applies to everything. There's an intermediary required for objects of this earth to interact with each other. Okay, C.S. Lewis talks about this a lot in his talks, in his thinking also. He brought this back up, but basically the idea here, and I can't spend a ton of time on this, but the idea is that there's an intermediary. In other words, there's always three involved. Okay, why does this matter? Because it fundamentally changes the idea of the stuff around you. Okay, if in our modern thinking, again, we don't think of stuff at all. It's just atoms and it's just stuff. But it's what allows us to relate to each other. Okay? That's what makes it interesting. The stuff is the intermediary between two people. And just like Christ is the intermediary between God and man. And so there's a lot of thinking about this, and it was fundamental to Christian thought for 1,000 years. Okay, but I just want to bring it up now because we're going to bring up the principle of the triad in medieval look. Okay, but basically the principle of plenitude was something Plato came up with, which is this idea: the universe must be fully exploited, nothing must go to waste. Okay, the idea here was that he reasoned out, and again, we don't have time to go through this. He reasoned out that there's no way you can waste anything. There's no such thing as space. Okay. Now today you think about it, and there's a famous picture of a blue dot, and it's the Earth from 4 billion miles away. And the idea is that, you know, we're so small, and look at all the space full of nothingness that surrounds us, right? And we're so used to thinking that way, we don't realize how that's so anti-culture, anti-Western culture to think about vast amounts of nothingness. Okay. Western culture was used to the idea that there is nothing wasted. Everything has some kind of reason for its existence. Okay, and so for example, when you think about the universe, is the universe mostly space? Or is there something that ties everything together? Okay, and again, your imagination can go one way or the other. All the equations work the same as far as the physics of everything. But yet, you know, the imagination that thinks about emptiness comes to one set of conclusions, and the imagination that thinks about plenitude comes to a different set of conclusions entirely. Okay, so this is important. The philosopher king, Eliana, that's what you were talking about. Yeah, Plato recognized that there was that we must be ruled by, here's the way he put it, those who are only interested in the changing of the world of the senses are called sight lovers. Plato likens them to blind men who have no true knowledge of reality and no clear standard of perfection in their mind to which they can turn to and study before laying down rules of right and wrong. These sight lovers are not fit to be guardians. In other words, his basic idea was that you cannot figure out how society should look unless you can look past the world of the senses. Okay? You have to be able to see deeper than what's around you in order to make sense, in order to make up rules. And so he talks quite a bit about the philosopher king. Okay, now I don't have time to get into it, but I did want to go ahead and play a slide of the allegory of the cave. This is the last one, okay? And are y'all familiar with the allegory of the cave? Have you heard of that? Okay, well, okay. I don't know if I need to play it because we might run short on time, but let me go ahead and play it real quick, just because I think it'll help some of you, but also it might refresh. Okay, so oh yeah, I did. I started it. There we go. Okay. Oh, I just realized something. I don't have any sound. Gosh, I didn't even think about. I mean, I do have sound, but it's not very loud. Let's see how loud it is.
Big topics you might tackle figuratively.
There we go. Okay, so I just wanted to play that because just to give you an idea that, okay, there we go. Okay, so to give you an idea that that people are thinking about some of these concepts, and as Christians living in the 21st century and even in the 2000s, we've gone so far on the science side that I think in some sense we've lost the ability to see things in any other way but objective. You know, this is a thing, and this is the words we use to describe things, and not realize that there's so much more behind what we're talking about. Okay, but so now with Aristotle. By the way, all these concepts we're going to bring up with the subsequent civilizations. So I wanted to introduce these thoughts here. Aristotle brought up the concept of telos. Okay, that's the idea of the purpose of something. Okay, and eudaimonia in Nicomachean Ethics. Are you familiar with the word eudaimonia? Anyone heard of that?
Is it like just flourishing?
Flourishing, that's right. Yes, human flourishing. We're going to watch a quick video on this also because I think the video explains it a lot better. And could y'all hear it okay? I'm sorry about the sound thing, but okay. Let's go in. I'm going to let you watch telos and eudaimonia. Here's the thing to think about, okay, is think about like trans, okay? A trans person has lost their telos, okay? Now, what does that mean? Again, watch a video and think about that, okay? They've lost the purpose of the thing itself. And eudaimonia, which would be the idea of flourishing, how does flourishing work? And when you think of cultural apologetics, you can start bringing up these concepts once you understand them a little more. So let me go ahead and play this video. This is just a little bit longer, but I'm going to stop it halfway through the video. Okay. So he talks about several concepts. One of them includes the eudaimonia and the golden mean together. So telos, eudaimonia, and the golden mean, really important concept for actually even for everyday life. Okay, go ahead and play it. Okay, so I wanted to bring that up. Did you get that? So there's a telos, and then there's the golden mean. And these are important concepts, and I'll give you some examples of why they're important. But like say, actually here, let me see if I've got this. Okay, so you've got the implication, more is not always better. A healthy culture flourishes with balance. There's a golden mean. And so here's an example, like in 2024 America, we value freedom, okay? Well, the apologetic is how much freedom? Too much, and it's a vice, and too little, and it's a vice, right? So this is an example of a Christian apologetic based on the golden mean. You can take any value in your current culture and show how the Christian version or the Jesus version is the mean instead of the extreme, okay? Now, if you don't have this, if you don't understand Aristotle and the golden mean, then the normal thinking, which is not actually, it's not intuitive, but the normal thinking would be, hey, the more freedom, the better. The more freedom, the better, right? But no one's ever thought, hey, you bring up Aristotle and you realize, no, that's not true at all, okay? So this would be an example of how there's a lot of apologetics, cultural apologetics, that are found in just recognizing the golden mean. And that golden mean deals with eudaimonia, which I don't know if I explained it all the way, but the idea is a flourishing people makes a flourishing culture. Okay, so both those come together. And we must find the golden means with regards to desire. Okay, I'm going to get into this. Before I do, any questions about the golden mean or the telos? Okay. By the way, and the other apologetic that's coming out here again is like with trans. I'm going to give you like five different angles that can be used. But one of these is that somebody who's thinking about getting an operation or whatever, they are fundamentally the meaning of what it means to be a male or a female in their imagination. Their meaning that's been associated is biological. They've lost any other meaning with male and female. So that's helpful by itself to be able to restore or to bring maybe for the first time, to restore or bring to the first time a better definition of womanhood or manhood. Okay, so that helps their imagination, which also helps them grow. But the other one is to be able to say, hey, how does this fulfill your telos? Well, being able to talk about it. The third way is the golden mean with regards to desire, okay? Because here's the thought here is when you apply the golden mean to desire is things we want, right? We want something, we desire it. And the golden mean says, hey, you know what? The vice is on both sides. Not getting what we desire and getting too much of what we desire, right? So it applies to desire also. And this is a internal apologetic. Okay, it goes back to James. Okay, what James says in the Bible about, listen, don't you realize that the quarrels and fightings are the result of your desires which wage war within you? Okay, and so here's James 4, right? What causes fights and quarrels? Don't they come from your desires of battle within you? Okay, so in other words, another apologetic is related to desire. Each of these. I'll just share it with you and we could talk about it. But the idea here is that one layer of desire is the desire to acquire. Okay? This means that you and I, we're out to find pleasure, experiences, money, emotions, food, children, houses, cars, knowledge, position, power, right? And Nietzsche referred to this as the will to power or survival, right? In other words, we want stuff. It's also called basal, carnal, or instinctive. We all want stuff. That's not necessarily wrong, but it is pitted against other desires. Okay, now in modern culture, if you want it, it's a dignity of an individual to have the right to go pursue it. Okay, but when you think about in cultural apologetics, you could think in terms of, that's fine, but what if you have other desires and they're competing with each other? So this is an internal apologetic, doesn't require the Bible or even understanding anything about God, just to be able to bring up, hey, is all you desire is to get stuff, to acquire stuff, right? And so there's another set of desires, which are the desire and a thirst for meaning, right? This is a desire to connect our existence to a greater reality and to validate ourselves from the inside out. So this is a more, and this is like an upside down pyramid because it's more basic than the desire to acquire. And I'll go further. We also have another layer of desire, which is related to the desire to create. Okay? We want to connect our meaningful moments into a whole, and we want to know that our lives matter. This is related. This is why a lot of times when you answer the question, who are you? You answer it with what you do. I don't know if you notice that, but sometimes we'll ask, what are you? Oh, I'm an engineer, or I'm a student. Okay? We say the answer to who are you, we answer with our work of creating because it's so fundamental of a desire. We want to create with our lives. And more fundamental than that is our desire for ultimate fulfillment or shalom or a connection with God or rest, right? And there's a reason in cultures, really in every culture, you see that rest is fundamentally a part of every culture. Okay, so I wanted to bring this up because when you use the golden mean, then a whole set of apologetics or answers to questions start popping out. Okay, and that set is, hey, well, if it's related to what you want, well, let's talk about the middle of what you want. Yes. Oh, yeah.
How would creation differ from like the story part of the different aspects of
Okay, yeah, and nothing's so clean, right? But you can say creation can be even just the physical act of creation, right? You can, as an engineer, you wake up every day and you can't wait to go make your drawings and to build buildings, right? And that is fundamentally, maybe you'll give up anything. You'll give up acquiring things in order to perform that job of creating that building because it's so fundamental of a desire, right? So you can use this, for example, with trans, okay? A trans person may desire, now again, every trans person can be different, okay? But let's say somebody desires that they don't find meaning in being a woman. So they want to change who they are, right? But that's in contradiction to acquiring a family and acquiring a husband. It's also in contradiction possibly to what you want to do in life. And it can be in contradiction to being able to rest with God depending on your beliefs. Okay, but basically being able to break down, and you can use this again, the golden mean applies to not just desire, but you can use it in any area. And it can help you understand even yourself better. It's like, well, if you just strongly desire something, well, what else do you desire? Or what's deeper in your desires? And they are at war. They are at war within you. And you're choosing a more fundamental desire or a greater desire versus choosing something that might, a good example might be, a husband might desire a different situation with his family, like to just leave his family. But his family is meaningful. So the desire to acquire something different is tempered by his desire for a meaningful life, right? So sometimes we just lose sight of this and we take somebody for what they're saying at face value instead of seeing deeper what's going on. Yes. Yeah, and I will say, yes, you're right. Western culture is, but so is Eastern culture. Okay, because this idea of like not necessarily owning things, or that is a very small percentage of Eastern culture, right? Most Eastern culture is actually based on gold, right? Like you look at Hindu culture, you do have people teaching this is the way, follow it, but most people are just like in Western culture, they're acquiring, right? But it would probably work itself out in different ways. The formula or the balance of what's going on. But yes, every Every culture is in contradiction with itself. And as a Christian, you're able to point this out. And that gives you points because you're bringing even the culture to its telos, to its actually, or its eudaimonia. What is it actually looking for? And in that sense, you're blessing the culture. And when you bless the culture, people are looking for the origin of that blessing, right? So you look like a positive alternative because you're bringing up something that makes a lot of sense, right? So, and this is very different than simply sharing the gospel without any context at all, right? So, okay, any other questions or thoughts? Okay, let's keep going. Okay, and you can pull me back on this, but okay, let's keep going. So Augustine, okay, this is really important. Again, I just picked out Plato, Aristotle, and Augustine. There's other people we could study, but these are really important. He wrote a book called Confessions. Have you heard of that book, Confessions by Augustine? If you haven't read it, it might be worth reading. It's interesting, but basically, Augustine, all he does, okay, and you could say all, and I'm saying the tongue-in-cheek here a little bit. All he does in Confessions is share his testimony, okay? But he does something that I think each of us should be convicted by. He treats his testimony as the answer to civilization. Okay? His own testimony. You could say, well, who the heck does he think he is, right? Well, he thinks of himself like you should think of yourself. Okay? And the idea is that we sometimes lose sight, we sometimes lose sight of the power of our testimony. Okay, and so here's some thoughts that come. In our postmodern, socially connected world, one can find someone willing to agree with any belief or practice. How do we know how to assess our own spiritual state in a world of mixed messages? Who do you trust? Autobiographies, and autobiography is another way of stating the idea of your testimony, your story. Okay, and I don't mean even 5-minute version. Okay, it can be a very detailed version. Autobiographies have apologetic value because they serve as spiritual mirrors that aid us in assessing our spiritual identity. Augustine's Confessions is a spiritual autobiography that serves as an excellent mirror from which to examine our lives. Okay, so the idea here is the greatest thing you might actually do with your life is just write down your struggles on paper. Okay, and the reason is simply because other people will compare their lives to your life. And that's how it's intended to be. You could say the greatest apologetic has and always will be your life. Okay? But displaying your life, I've thought about this in so many times, for the last 5 years after my classes, just thinking about this one aspect alone, that could it be that the greatest work of your life is your testimony? The greatest work of your life in the sense of even the accomplishment of what it can do. Augustine wrote it down and it changed Western civilization. People compared their lives to Augustine's struggles for the next 1,000 years. Actually, they do it today. You can read the book, right? But Augustine wasn't special. If you read Confessions, you find out this is not a great man struggling with something. This is an ordinary man. It could be your testimony, okay? There's nothing about it other than the fact that he valued it. He valued his testimony to a high degree, and it wasn't just, again, and I'm not trying to diminish the idea of a 5-minute testimony or a salvation story. Those all have their place. But I think in our own imagination, the definition of testimony it creates a certain meaning to it. Okay? And that meaning doesn't lend itself toward cultural engagement. But if you redefine and understand, and again, Augustine helps us do this when you look at Confessions, when you redefine and understand that everything in your life is worth writing down because it's a mirror for somebody else, and it may be the best mirror. Why? Because it's you. It's a life. And that's all it takes, right? It doesn't matter the value of the life. The value is infinite. It's the blood of Jesus, right? So let's keep going. Spiritual autobiographies bring clarity to our spiritual appearance. Augustine recognized this power in his Confessions. I need not tell all this to you, my God, but in your presence I tell it to my own kind, to those other men, however few, who may perhaps pick up this book, and I tell it so that I and all who may read my words may realize the depths from which we are to cry to you. All he wanted to say is, I just want to convey how hard this has been, right? God did all the rest. Now, I want to bring this up because I just don't know if this happens enough in the world. Okay. Now, I want to finish with something about our testimony that I don't know if we realize. C.S. Lewis, what time is it? Just want to make sure we're okay on time. 7. It's 7 o'clock. Okay, so we got about 10 more minutes. C.S. Lewis, people have been studying his life in universities ever since he passed away. Okay, well, actually, even while he was alive. But most people agree that his greatest thought. Okay, you ever wondered what was the greatest thought of a really magnificent thinker? And most people agree that his greatest thought was that reality is an iconoclast, or reality is an idol breaker. Okay, reality is an idol breaker. And what does that mean? I'm going to play one last YouTube for you. But before I do, I just wanted to give you some thoughts about this because it relates to your testimony, okay? Is that as you go through life, your beliefs in God will always fall short, okay? No matter what you believe about God right now, as you stand, whatever it is, it will fall short. Okay? In other words, reality will come crashing down on your beliefs. And it will happen over and over again. But the reason is because reality is always destroying the idol that you've made. And reality will continue doing that. In other words, here's the thought, okay? Reality is meant to lead us to Jesus. Remember, He's the way, the truth, and the life. He's the truth. Okay? Reality is meant to lead us to Jesus. That is a cultural thought. See, we think we have to come up with something unreal or something super real, something supernatural to bring to people. But when you understand your life through how reality continually busts it up and brings it, even always brings you back to Jesus over and over again, you start realizing that reality is defined by Jesus. Okay? See, that's very different because what that means is in cultural apologetics, it means that you hold the higher ground. You hold the ground of reality. Okay? It's not based on a bunch of just beliefs that are out there. And so here, I'm going to go ahead and let you listen to C.S. Lewis, and then we'll close with any questions. Okay? So, and this is just 2 minutes. I picked a short version, but there's longer versions of this. Okay? Okay, so did you catch that? So the idea here is that I want to finish here with with 1 Corinthians 1. It's related. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those who are being saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise. Now remember, again, this is basically ancient civilizations. Really every civilization has relied on the wisdom of the wise, the intelligence of the intelligence, and philosophers. But your faith is based on reality. It's not based on wisdom and intelligence. It's just based on reality. Okay? So the idea here in 1 Corinthians 1, where's the teacher of the law? Where's the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? It's made foolish because reality always wins over any man-made attempts. That's what's being said here. Anything that the Greeks were getting from wisdom or the Romans were getting from intelligence, all of those things would always be busted up. And reality would always win. In other words, they would always be found to be foolish. For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God, the wisdom of God. Right? So this is what actually really happens is just reality changes people. And let me finish. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God, this is what we call it. Okay, we call reality foolishness and weakness. Okay, right? And weakness of God is stronger than human strength. Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. Now, what's foolish? The foolish things are the things that don't get any attention. In other words, it takes a wise person to come up with the ideas that get attention. The foolish things are the things that don't get any attention. It's just reality. Okay? God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. The weak things are the things that go without being said. Okay, right? They just are there. God chose the lowly things of this world, despise things, and the things that are not to nullify the things that are. So the idea is, think of what you were when you encountered reality. Right? Not earthly wisdom, not philosophy. All these things were ultimately hindrances. In other words, what you found in your best friend, I guess I'll just read it the way I put it. Reality is your best friend in culture because your testimony follows and continues to follow reality. Okay? And this is powerful because otherwise, this goes back to encouragement even. Okay? Your faith is not something you're trying to convince culture of. You're trying to remove the hindrances, all those voices that claim wisdom, all those voices that claim other things. But what you're talking about is, hey, look at my testimony. You know, I thought this and it was busted up, but then I realized this. And it was busted up, but then I realized this. And you go from one thing to another, and it always ends with the truth being God is even more a part of it than ever. That's what it means to be a believer. That's what your life is. And that is actually the greatest apologetic that there ever will be, right, for culture. But I think the thing we miss is this idea of being able to share properly about our testimony, who we are. Okay? So here's the homework. Okay? I want you to review, now let me give you the reason behind this, but review these slides from the 4 previous sessions, or actually re-listen to them, okay? And I would like each of you to submit one question from each of the previous sessions, right? So you got to think about it enough to come up with 4 questions, okay? Now they can be simple if you want. Again, these are for your benefit, but I want to know kind of where everyone's at. Also, and I think it'll also help everybody to hear this. Okay, so that's your homework, is to review the 4 sessions, submit one question. Okay, any questions before we quit today? What we talked about is ancient culture, removing hindrances. Next week we're going to talk about medieval culture. It's faith for 1,000 years, and we're going to get even more specific into cultural apologetics. And then the following 2 weeks, we'll get even more specific because we'll be landing in modern times, okay? But so what we're doing is just building a foundation and kind of growing it up, and then you kind of get a lot of answers that kind of just come out for themselves, almost. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We'll just let everyone trickle in, and hopefully if you miss, you guys have all been getting the videos. I redid video 1, by the way. Okay, I took just the sound and put it with the slides to match all the other ones and make it less distracting. Okay, so